Welcome to Psychology of Pilgrimage. I'm your host, Heather Warfield. I'm joined today by Rose Horswill, who is a major in the United States Army and has served in the Signal Corps for the past 15 years. In her last assignment, she spent 3 years as an assistant professor of history at the United States Military Academy at West Point, her own alma mater. During that time, she designed and taught courses in 20th century military history, the history of irregular warfare, World War I from a global perspective, and the history of the American Armed Forces, as well as senior colloquia on military humanitarianism and Eurasian borderlands. Her doctorate is in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and her personal academic focus has been primarily on Turkey and World War I. While she still enjoys scholarship in her own time, she currently serves in a strategic signal battalion stationed in Germany. She lives with her husband and 3 children, and loves bringing her family along on research trips and travel adventures. In this episode, we discuss a 2023 pilgrimage staff ride led by Major Horswill when she was at West Point. We get into the planning process and the educational philosophy behind these types of trips. We talk about how visiting battlefields and cemeteries can evoke emotional responses and how these sites can serve as important sites for reflection and remembrance. We also discuss the concepts of war and memory and how pilgrimages can be a significant way to walk in the footsteps of soldiers and those who have made historical pilgrimages to these battlefields and other sites. I invite you to listen along to our conversation. It's so nice to see you, Rose. I'm really happy that you had time to spend talking about all things pilgrimage this afternoon and this evening for you.
Thank you, Heather. It's really great to see you too. When you brought this up, I was so excited and I knew I just had to be part of it.
I was reflecting on the last time we saw each other because it didn't seem like it had been that much time. But the actual place that we last had any type of conversation was standing under the Arc de Triomphe in March of 2023. You were with cadets from the U.S. Military Academy, and we were all standing under the Arc for this nightly Ravivage ceremony that has been occurring every night since 1920 over the tomb of the unknown soldier. And it was a really profound moment to be able to stand there with the cadets and with you and with our other colleagues, knowing that this had happened for over 100 years. There were also cadets from Saint Cyr, which is France's military academy, who were present. And it seemed profound to have all of this coming together at the same time. It was the last night of the West Point trip to France. And seeing all of these pieces together at the same time was an image and a memory that I will not forget. And I was also recalling, you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, that at the end of the ceremony, the Syrians broke into song, broke into their hymn, and then the hymn ended, and I heard a voice starting to emerge, and it was one of your colleagues from West Point who was starting to sing. Was it Alma Mater? I don't remember what he started to sing. And then this small group of about a dozen cadets and faculty sang the West Point hymn under the Arc de Triomphe. And it was quiet, but it was quite a powerful moment, and certainly a moment of pride for me as an American to be there with all of you and to hear this new group of Army leaders singing and having this experience under this historical structure in the heart of Paris.
That's absolutely right. And I had forgotten about that until you just brought it up, but I absolutely remember it. And we were not as well practiced as the Syrians. And like you said, there were only a dozen of us, 9 cadets and 3 faculty members, myself included. And one of the other faculty members, Lieutenant Colonel, now retired, Dave Seary, and myself were both old grads from West Point back in the day. And it was Lieutenant Colonel retired Seary that started singing our alma mater in response to all of the singing that the Syrian cadets had done. And afterwards, he was telling me we couldn't just be quiet. We had to join in on this. And it was quiet, I suppose, in response to perhaps 4 dozen other Frenchmen that were singing their piece. But like you said, it's a small role that 12 Americans were able to play in that ceremony, much like the small role that the Americans in the Yankee Division were able to play in World War One.
And so it's probably appropriate then that we really begin our conversation with talking about how our paths intersected to begin with. And this study abroad slash staff rides slash pilgrimage experience that you and your colleagues at West Point planned and I think executed beautifully in during spring break of 2022. Sorry, 2023.
Yep, 2023. That's all right. I feel like the planning began many years prior to that. And so the fact that it culminated with us on the ground in 2023 was, it could have been the year prior. It's all right. It was, I'm trying to remember when we first met. I know we were introduced by Captain Jonathan Bratton. He was one of my colleagues at West Point when I was teaching there. And I was in my, I want to say it was probably the summer after I had been teaching for about a year at the military academy in the history department. And Jonathan had just joined the department for the year. And the way they plan things there when it comes to staff rides and cadet trips, and they usually call them staff rides. I know we're going to talk about that later. That's for budgetary reasons. But the way they plan the cadet trips is it starts about 2 years in advance with all of the pitching of ideas by the faculty members. And I knew I wanted to do something related to World War One because that's my background. But my background is also in Eastern Turkey and the Caucasus, and that's a lot more complicated than taking a group of cadets to France. And so I kind of landed on this topic for several reasons that we can go deeper into if you'd like. But I also knew that Jonathan had spent a lot of time studying this and writing about the soldiers of the Yankee Division, in the course of his scholarship over years and years. And I had a special connection to that division through other faculty members in the history department at West Point who had done similar trips that were a little more focused on memory as opposed to just battlefield experiences. I decided that this was the right fit. And through Jonathan, I was introduced to you. I was introduced to Lieutenant Colonel Feith and Gilles Lejeune and several other people who dedicated a lot of their intellectual energy and time to helping me conceptualize this project. And with all of that support and ideas, I was able to create and execute this trip.
When you think about or conceptualize a trip, taking students to another country, I mean, anyone who's been involved in any level of study abroad trip, I mean, this is a huge undertaking for so many reasons, oftentimes that have nothing to do with the curriculum or the stated purpose, more having to do with logistics and someone gets sick or there's an emergency. And so this is it, there's so much planning that goes into this. And when you think about a staff ride, well, first of all, let's pause there because some listeners may not know this term. It's a very common term for those of us who are interested in battlefields and then by extension, battlefield pilgrimages. But I'm not sure that people who may be interested in pilgrimages generally have an understanding or have even considered what a staff ride might be.
Absolutely. It's so a staff ride is a popular way to describe a participatory field trip for members of the U.S. Armed Forces. And it's become very popular in the last several decades. And essentially what it is, and it's usually done among a staff. And so that hence the term staff ride. The staff at a battalion level, a brigade level, a division level, these are all echelons of how the U.S. Army is organized. And the staff are the individuals that are supporting and conducting a lot of the planning for the commanders. So academics and military officers decided that it's valuable to take a break from your day-to-day operational work and return to a moment in the past and have both a an academic workload connected to studying what happens in a particular battle or related to a particular theme, and then go physically to that place to be able to see the battlefield, walk the battlefield, and take on the personalities of the leaders that were in charge there and try to understand how they were thinking and how they came to their decisions. And for the staff ride, that's really what it is about. It's not critiquing what happened, but understanding how leaders thought so that you, in turn, the participants of the staff ride, can go forth and be a better leader.
So the U.S. Army has published a manual called the Staff Ride. From the Army perspective, these experiences are quite prescriptive in that there are particular there's a particular set of curricula that are covered at each site, which is called right.
That's right.
And so participants are quite involved in terms of doing individual research on an element of a battle or a person or an outcome. And then these participants have the opportunity to present their findings or their research while standing in a group at the site.
That's right. And that's it's it's very specifically designed so that this trip is not a tour, that there's full participation by the officers or soldiers that are involved and part of the experience, that they're presenting, they're not just passive participants.
So one of the elements of this staff ride book that I find really interesting and has been a curiosity for me is found in the preface of the book. In the last few editions, each new edition, there is a preface that is written or signed off by the chief of staff as well as the secretary of the army. And interestingly, in the last couple of editions, I noticed that that the wording is such that there is a focus on the psychology of people in combat and other crises. And that's interesting to me, given the fact that, of course, this is right up my alley. Of course, I'm very interested in the psychology of people in combat and other crises and battlefields and pilgrimages. And yet I do not see much psychological research embedded into the staff ride book itself. And certainly motivations, cognitions, leadership, decision making. This is sort of a psychological arc. And yet it seems that there may be other types of activities that are or internal processes happening to the people in combat who were there previously, and also for staff ride participants, that there may be some type of inner disorientation that could occur at a site or as a result of being in a place where combat or other trauma has occurred. I'm curious how this is addressed in this staff ride experience.
So I think you've pointed out a wonderful opportunity for the editors of this journal or this book, this staff ride, to incorporate some of the recent studies in psychology and actually put that into the book. Because what I've noticed is that word, like you said, is not used holistically. It's used to describe how the leaders think, and it's very general and superficial, quite honestly. And so yes, the intent is to understand how the decisions were made, but to understand less in a psychological lens and more through the frame of military decision-making processes and templates and other things that present day soldiers and service members would be familiar with. And so the loose use of psychology is a big area that, with the help of experts, participants in these staff rides could really take advantage of, I think.
It would be interesting to see psychology faculty included in staff rides. I have, I'm sure it exists, and I don't know of many examples of what that looks like.
I have not experienced a staff ride personally where psychologists or experts in that field were participating.
Well, there are opportunities. I'm getting it out
Yes.
there. For Big Army, there are opportunities here. I'd like to go back to a bit of what you said. You mentioned that you had a personal connection to this particular staff ride experience. And I'd like to hear about what that personal connection is.
Absolutely. I'd love to talk about that. So, my great grandfather, his name was Harry Eli Monroe the first. There's since a fifth in that line through my cousins and uncle. And Harry Eli Monroe, he was a private in World War One. I know very little about him. I know his service dates were from 1917 through 1919. And so, in terms of World War One, I imagine he may not have been in combat. He may have arrived for occupation. And I learned about him because growing up, my grandfather, also a Harry Eli Monroe, number two, he had a photograph of him in his knee length overcoat as part of the service uniform back in World War One for army soldiers. And he had this photograph of him that was always on the wall. And next to it was a photograph of my grandfather, who was also a service member. He was a career service member in the Korean and Vietnam wars, also in the U.S. Army. And I would ask my grandfather about him, but he was always very reluctant to talk about him. He was also very reluctant to talk about his own service. And so I never got the full story of this person, my great grandfather or my great grandfather. And um, after my grandfather passed, my parents inherited a lot of his effects, including a shadow box of my great grandfather's patches and medals. And so it was very clear from that, like, yes, he was overseas during World War One, during the end of World War One. But then he also had a patch as part of the shadow box for the Yankee Division. And I had to go look this up. I knew he wasn't a career soldier. I knew that he had joined the war effort and then went on to civilian life. But the patch intrigued me because was an officer at this point when I was learning about learning a little bit more about this, and not yet a historian either. But I had not heard of this insignia before, and it wasn't a current patch that I'd recognized. And so I looked it up and realized it was made up of several National Guard units from New England, including Rhode Island, where I'm from and where my grandparents were from. And so that was when I first learned about the Yankee Division, the 26th Division. And I just find it so interesting that artifacts like this can just remain unnoticed until these serendipitous moments when the right person sees it and wants to look into it. And I think with family military history, this happens a lot. Like, depending on the point in your life, you become interested in researching what happened to your ancestors or relatives who served in or outside of combat. And I'll admit, I didn't go much deeper into it at the time. And so that was why, when this opportunity arose, and I learned through Jonathan Bratt at the 26th Division was something that he researched. It's like, I know that. I have an ancestor that was part of that division. I'd love to continue on this journey and find a way to introduce this to other people, because this unit is not in the popular narrative about World War One and the American participation in that. And so I'm so glad that this particular memory was able to resurface for me and inspire not only the pilgrimage staff ride that I was able to bring to fruition, but also more scholarly questions and strings to pull in the course of my own research.
So you had a couple of major threads coming together. You had the family connection through your great grandfather to the Yankee Division. You were working in the Department of History as an assistant professor at West Point. You happened to bump into Jonathan Bratton, who had written about the Yankee Division, who introduced you to me. who, of course, has interest in pilgrimages. And then it seems like all of these are coalescing into a very dynamic educational experience that is both your own personal pilgrimage, kind of retracing where the Yankee Division was in France, but also bringing along students with you. Can you describe what were some of the initial conversations with students? How do students start getting engaged in a staff ride before they even go to a particular site? So they're students at West Point, and they're preparing for several months. I'm assuming, is it at the beginning of the academic year, and then they go during spring break? What happens in those initial months to help prepare students to take a trip like this?
Absolutely. I'd love to talk about it. And like you said, this isn't to be taken lightly. This is a, spring break trip, see the flyer and hop on the plane the next week. The way the history department at West Point does these staff rides is they have donors that provide the funding for it and allow the students and the faculty to pay for these trips. And so they have to be meaningful. They have to be worthwhile. And they also have to be intrinsically connected to the broader academic experience for the cadets. And so the cadets that go on this trip, after about a year of the planning and the approvals and the broad outline of what's going to happen in the fall semester of 2022 going into 2023, that's when I chose the other two faculty members that would be part of this team. I asked them to join me, and together we selected 9 cadets and alternates to come on this trip. And then around about October, preceding the March trip, we brought them together, and it begins very broad, just like how you would teach a course, explaining to them this staff ride. We knew that they were interested in it. It was pitched as in the flyers and whatnot, the recruiting movement. It was pitched as a World War I pilgrimage staff ride. So it was different than just a battlefield tour. And I think that piqued a lot of interest for cadets, because a lot of the spring break trips and then the longer summer trips that the history department typically does year after year are very focused on battlefield tours. And so this was different. And so it piqued the interest of a different group of cadets than the ones that want to go to Normandy or Gettysburg or things like that, they're very popular year after year. And it was also new. And so that was exciting for some as well. And so our first couple of meetings were just explaining to them what this is going to be. We're going to be following this division through where the Yankee Division, where they slept, where they lived, where they fought during the First World War. And we're going to follow them, not necessarily chronologically, but in a way that makes sense throughout their time in France. The subsequent meetings, myself and the other faculty members, we did a lot of research on the back end, looking for lists of soldiers that had records attached to them, especially officers that had graduated from West Point, whose personal effects and personal papers were part of the archives and special collections that were there at the school. And we came up with this list of people and gave that to the cadets and made sure that everybody either chose or was assigned several different people. And so the first piece of the cadets' participation was learning about these individuals and reading about them and figuring out as much as they could, whether it was just birthplace or prior occupation to the war, if they had done something of valor and received accommodation, if they had died, if they had survived, what did they go on to do, family members, anything that they could find to get to know these people, so that it was getting a little deeper and deeper into, this isn't just going to the battlefield and seeing what happened and recounting the battle like a staff ride typically does, or even just from the leader's perspective of how, making decisions of troop movements and whatnot. But they were starting to realize that the battlefields that they would see on the trip itself were lived and experienced by these real people, these people that they were studying. And in the final meetings leading up to the staff ride, we would have the cadets kind of prepare comments and share what they were starting to find and get excited about it, and assign them additional themes, so that when we were on the sites, at the stands, because we did still use that terminology to structure parts of the trip. It wasn't just the faculty or the other individuals that were assisting the staff ride kind of talking about what happened, but there were moments to prompt the cadets to say, here we are at this space, please tell us about this individual that you studied, or please tell us about this theme or this poem that you read and prepared, so that they were fully engaged both before arriving in France and then throughout the trip.
I'd like to go back to a piece that you mentioned about how this particular trip may have appealed to a different set of students than maybe other traditional staff rides. And it is the use of the word pilgrimage and the concept of pilgrimage. I can imagine that there was some discussion around what does that mean to frame a staff ride as a pilgrimage, and sort of how did you arrive at a shared knowledge collectively?
So I'll start with, I don't know that we ever did arrive at a shared knowledge. And I think going into it, we were okay with that, because this was the first time we had, or the department had branded a trip as a pilgrimage staff ride. And so it was new, and it was certainly a learning opportunity. They had done trips in the past that focused on memory or soldiers' writings and poetry and things like that, but nothing that intended to learn about the people and walk in their footsteps and physically see the places that they experienced, and these points of connection or these places of encounter, and go there and do it. And so I think it was different for everybody. We talked about this idea of a pilgrimage having religious opportunities, and we did have some cadets that were very religious and did kind of take that into this experience with them, being in some of the caves and seeing the soldiers' drawings of crucifixes and things of that nature. And some cadets who share the faith of some of the soldiers who we were studying had that connection in that way. For others, there was an even more, not simple, but for lack of a better word, yes, simple connection to just being a soldier. And so these cadets, they hadn't yet commissioned. So they were in their second, third, and fourth years at West Point. Most of them were in their third year. So they would have another year to go before commissioning as officers in the United States Army. And so for some of them, the connection was they were very young and they're picturing themselves in this position. And so the pilgrimage connection is simply that of a soldier stepping in the footsteps of another soldier, and experiencing that journey from place to place. For me, I'd love to say that I felt a connection to my grandfather, and we talked about this when we finally came together in Below, how the whole time I was so consumed with the logistics that all of the savoring the experience of being in those places, it happened much later when I was reflecting. And so the pilgrimage for me was experienced by reflecting on my notes and the photographs and the conversations that happened after being physically in that place. And so it's tough to say that we came to a collective understanding of the pilgrimage because it was different for a lot of people. The last thing I'll say about that is for the other faculty members who, and myself, who had been in combat previously, there's also that connection to standing in these places where severe trauma had been experienced and leaving the familiar and going to the unfamiliar. And there's just a lot of themes that I think we could have unpacked, but my background is in history. My colleague's background was in history. And so while we wanted to make sure that the cadets understood that they were getting exposed to something different with this trip, we didn't want to impose a false sense of understanding of how someone studying psychology would look at this, because that's not our background. But part of the value was that they could take it in whatever meaningful way it was for them.
You're highlighting a big point here around battlefield pilgrimages, which is the experiences of people who have been in combat going to another place of combat, another battlefield. It may not be Iraq, it may not be Afghanistan, it may be a World War I battlefield. There's some type of connection to the place, even though it's not identical. And I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit on that.
I'll do my best. So I've served combat tours in both Iraq and Afghanistan. The faculty members, then Captain Jake Morris, he's now a major, and Lieutenant Colonel retired Dave Seary had both been in combat in the Middle East as well over the past decade or so, 2 decades of the United States' military activities in the war there. I've been to a lot of battlefields in my life and just visiting them out of interest and in combat and out of combat, a lot of places of memory in the United States as well. And so had my colleagues. But every time you go to a new one, it really does feel different. And I think we have a little bit of an advantage because we're all historians and we all care deeply about understanding the past and connecting with people and their stories. But when you go to a new battlefield, for me, sometimes it's just a place of quiet. You just kind of stand there and you kind of feel and you kind of reflect. And maybe you're just observing the grass and you're observing the trees and you're observing the landscape. And then the thoughts start to pass through your mind of, wow, this must have been really, really tough. Like just looking how far it is over there and that hill and how you don't see what's going on beyond that undulating terrain if there's a formation coming at you or artillery fire. And your mind starts to expand on what it may have been like for those soldiers. And having been in combat, you really understand as well that you can't possibly understand what it was like for them. And I think that's important too, that it's just a small slice of that connection in those places. And the other thing about this is beyond the battlefield. On our trip, we went to a lot of cemeteries as well. There's several American cemeteries in France. And we stopped at a lot of them and we spent time there. And that was usually the place where we had the cadets talk about the soldiers that they had researched, who had died. And in many cases, after we had done our huddle as the group or spoken with the cemetery superintendent for the American memorials, the cadets had time to go out among the graves and look for the names of the people that they had researched, if they had researched somebody who had died in battle in a particular campaign and were laid to rest there. And that brings up a whole another sort of emotions for people who have either been in combat or for the cadets who are imagining their futures potentially in a combat scenario. And certainly anybody who's lost a friend or a family member. And so that aspect of the pilgrimage was again another layer of meaning.
I think the idea of being a soldier, the identity of being a soldier, walking in the footsteps of other simple soldiers, separated by 100 years, that is so profound. And I think that's the whole point, isn't it? That these cadets, you and your colleagues, simple soldiers, walking in the footsteps of soldiers who had gone before. And I'm just envisioning how this looked all across France. Could you share what the itinerary was loosely? What are the sites that you visited? Where are the sites that you walked in the footsteps of these Yankee Division soldiers?
Absolutely. So some of this is logistically convenient and some of it is chronologically convenient, but it was intended to span the entire war for the Yankee Division on the Western Front in France, minus their initial arrival into France and their initial train up. And so the first place we went was Chateau Thierry, and this is the town where there's a very large American monument. And this is where we introduced the idea of U.S. memory in World War I. And this was another kind of sub-theme that we brought throughout the trip, just the idea of monuments and how Americans remember this, and then tried to pull that back down into how did family members remember the war? How did soldiers remember the war after the fact, the survivors? And how do we remember the war? And then from that introduction, we went into an overview of the Aisne-Marne salient and visited the museum in Chateau Thierry. And then through the next day, we stayed in that area and visited the Chemin des Dames, the Wazane American Cemetery. We talked about actions at Crayon. I know these are all just words, but if you're looking at a map, you can kind of follow along these battlefield places. And the Nivelle Offensive is a very popular theme that the cadets had all studied in their academic classes. And then the largest theme from that second day was the Yankee Division's being under the tutelage of their French allies very, very early in the war. When they first arrived, they had to train. Many of them had volunteered, many of them had been conscripted to support the war effort. And the training or lack thereof that they received in the United States before getting on a ship to join the war efforts was incredibly minimal. And the French allies that especially were in this sector, in the Chemin des Dames, were battle tested for years and very, very, very serious situations. And so the Yankee Division joined them to train for a period of time. And during that time, they sometimes slept and lived in caves that were in this area in the Chemin des Dames. And so we visited some of these caves, and from there we shifted to the more popular in American memory parts of World War I. So St. Miel and the Toul sector, and then Meuse-Argonne and the final stages of the war. And we went to several battlefields and American cemeteries in those areas while still trying to superimpose the specific points and moments of contact with the Yankee Division soldiers. Because it's very easy to think World War I and get caught up in Meuse-Argonne, the big campaign that ended the war, that the Americans participated in with their allies. But remembering that local Yankee Division actions in small, relatively unknown places outside of France, like Seychelles, and the Bois-le-Comte, and these names that are not part of typical American memory of World War I. That's where we tried to go. And in these places, we found some specific references to the Yankee Division. And in some other places, like in the Bois-le-Comte woods outside of Verdun, just northwest of Verdun, we found the trenches with the help of Lieutenant Colonel Fife, I've mentioned before, Benoit Fife, who was an incredible asset, helping us access some of these places and coordinate with local landowners and local mayors so that we could safely visit these spaces and not impose on the people who live there and experience this memory every day of their lives. But in the Bois-le-Comte, we found the trenches where members of the Yankee Division were standing when the war ended, essentially. And so we tried to follow them through those first 4 days of the trip, from where they began to where they were standing when the armistice occurred. And then after following that, for our 5th day, this was a day to kind of return to reflection. So we've followed their path. We've talked about a lot of the individuals. And this last day was a moment to intentionally pause and think about the soldiers. And this was my favorite day. I was so excited about this from the very beginning because we returned to Chateau Thierry, where we started at the huge American monument. And we met up with Gilles Lejeune. He's a local historian in the area. And he accompanied us on this final day of walking from Chateau Thierry through Barrage to below, essentially along the line that the Yankee Division fought at one point in World War I. And by making this walk, the cadets had a lot of quiet time to reflect. It was over several kilometers, sometimes just along the road. Sometimes we weren't. We did pause occasionally to talk about specific moments, and for Monsieur Lejeune to point out points of the battle, which is his specialty. But it was really a time for the cadets to reflect and just take in everything that they've had learned and witnessed and studied and talked about over the initial 4 days. And this was where we ended up meeting with you at the conclusion of our walk at the Yankee Division Church. And we both physically and literally went from a massive American monument through the battlefields from the soldier's perspective to this church in this small town in France that memorializes this division that most people in the United States have never heard of, including people like myself who grew up in Rhode Island, who were members of the U.S. Armed Forces. And here it was, the 26th Division, the Yankee Division, with a church dedicated to them, or with memorializing them in below France. And that was kind of where we ended the part of the pilgrimage staff ride on the Western Front. And in the final day, we went to Paris, participated in the Ravivage ceremony that we spoke about in the beginning, explored the Paris Post-1 archives with Mr. Brian Schell. And on the final day, we met back up with Lieutenant Colonel Thief, who had been such an amazing part of our experience at the Republican Guard in Paris, and met with his colleagues as well, and saw the Army Museum and some of those other things that we can't take a bunch of cadets to France without visiting. So that was our trip in a nutshell.
Of course, I want to come back and talk about coming into the church. It was a very rainy day. The weather was not
we were
optimal
soaking wet
in any way. And I thought, what is the mood going to be when these cadets make this trek, which is, I think, between 7 and 10 kilometers. I'm not sure the direct route that you all made, but it's not a short distance. And these cadets, I was standing out in the rain waiting for them for all of you to get to the church. And I saw them crest over the hill on the east side of Bellawood. I could hear them. They were in high spirits. It was so moving to see this moment of reenactment. And they're literally walking in the footsteps of the Yankee Division from over 100 years prior. And so they arrive at the church. We enter. I provide information and an overview of the church. And then several of the cadets also had prepared information. One in particular I'm thinking of talked about the importance of religion in World War I. It was a perfect setting for this presentation. And I think this idea of young men in 1918, many of whom had died right in this exact geographical location. Their names are etched onto stones that flank the walls of the church. I think it really hit home for these cadets that the people they had been researching were them. In another generation, these soldiers were them. And it was a really special moment for me. And I know for you, we didn't really have a chance to talk because events were unfolding so quickly. But it was beautiful to see you and to know that the work that you had put into this kind of culminating in the church.
Absolutely. And I verified because it was escaping me. It was 11 kilometers. So it really was an all day, moving quite slowly event. And it was pouring rain, which was just perfect because it set the mood in an important way. Just a small lens into the trauma that these soldiers experienced on these battlefields. But then, like you said, the cadets were in high spirits, and they were, and it wasn't flippant, it wasn't unmeaningful, but it was them excited. I really do believe this. It was them excited about, this journey kind of coming to an end. Again, this was spring break. They chose to be part of this trip, to come, follow me through the woods and the rain and cold France in March, and not spend their time on a beach in the Caribbean where several of their classmates might have been. And they loved it. They loved like how tough this was, and how it was really connecting them to something hard that soldiers 100 years, almost to the year. I think in a perfect world we would have got it in 2019, but 2023 was close enough. But almost to the year that their predecessor in the armed services had served and had walked those grounds and had returned to that church to pay their respects to their fallen comrades.
I do think that looking at the historical events of war through the lens of pilgrimages gives us the opportunity to commemorate soldiers and other service members who may have fought and or died in combat. And it also gives us the opportunity to retrace the steps of the pilgrims, the family members, the veterans of these units that went back to commemorate the war dead. So there are many layers of commemoration and of recognizing the impact of war, and also recognizing the particular service of individuals who had lives and stories and families and who lost their lives in these battlefields.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Many of the cadets, though they had yet to serve in an active duty capacity, had already classmates, friends, family members that had been part of the armed services. And so they didn't take the sacrifice lightly, and they were incredibly well postured to attempt to imagine what the early pilgrims to this area might have experienced, having lost their brothers in arms, or a son, or a brother. I think though none of the individuals in the group had a personal connection to someone that was in the Yankee Division, apart from myself, but that connection was still very poignant, and they were well prepared to think about it in that way.
I was so impressed with the level of maturity and the investment of the cadets, and they were really engaged in this process, and asked wonderful questions every time I had the opportunity to speak with one of them or a group of them. I came away from the experience being so impressed with their investment and their initiative in this learning process, and also could see that they were really grappling with big existential issues around what does war mean and why does war occur and what results from war, and thinking about how this is not an abstract concept. This is very personal, and sort of contemplating their own future.
As a military historian, as a historian first and a military historian as a facet of that, I couldn't agree more. I think it's so important for service members to understand the legacy of their actions. And for these cadets, they were spending their years, their daily activities preparing to take the oath of office and become a commissioned officer that may one day lead troops into combat. And understanding the significance of that, both in a historical perspective for the men and women that have gone before them, including the members of the Yankee Division in France, but in a very present sense as well. That is an incredible responsibility. And as faculty members at West Point, especially in the history department, we thought about that all the time in our conversations with each other, on how to make the content of the academic curricula that we were working through, how to make that important to them in a personal sense. And the young men and women that were on that trip, I mean, they're all incredible. They're just such wonderful people. I was so proud of them. Obviously, we hand selected them to come on the trip, so we wanted people that were interested in the history, and they weren't all history majors. Most of them were, but they weren't all. Some of them were just genuinely interested in this and learning about the legacy that they were joining in a new way. And so I'm very proud of them. And most of them are officers now. I think there's a couple that were on the younger side that will commission and graduate this year.
Since you've had a couple of years and a lot of life that has happened between the time that this staff ride occurred and present, are you able to reflect a bit on what this particular trip meant to you as a person, but also as an Army officer?
I'll do my best. I think about this a lot, and I keep returning to the idea that I have to do more with this project. Um, it certainly has to be from a history perspective because that's my background. But just this idea of pilgrimages and returning to these places of contact with soldiers of the past so fascinating to me. And this was honestly my first opportunity to really learn about something like this. In my own research, as I was working towards my doctorate, I focused on people as well, and I focused on a journey that various members of the US Army were going on. And so I knew I was always interested in these themes, but the idea of reframing it as it's not just a trip that people go on, but it can be a pilgrimage. It can be a connection, a specific connection to a place, to the past, and to historical actors. And so it was inspiring to me. I think that's the best way to describe it, is that this whole experience was incredibly inspiring and opened up a whole new window to how to approach historical questions. And a lot of that is thanks to you and your work for being the non-historian that was a big part of this project and revealing to me new ways of framing these questions. And so I really appreciate having your perspective on this. And so I just wanted to thank you again for um, how you inspired me on this project.
Thank you. And you inspired me also. One of the great joys of my career has been in the last couple of years being able to work with military historians who have been so receptive and warm and helpful and enthusiastic about my work. I think that pilgrimage studies lends itself to this sort of wide aperture because it's so interesting, and pilgrimages have been important parts of travel and historical quests. And so likewise, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this West Point adventure. I left certainly inspired, and I also left with a renewed validation that battlefield pilgrimages are important, and our understanding of the historical pilgrimages that have occurred to places like Bellawood and Verdun and other places of significance, that being able to look at these places through the lens of those pilgrims who visited early on and have continued to visit, we can learn a lot about people, and we can also learn a lot about how war impacts people and how trauma impacts people and how they make meaning of these catastrophic events.